We just want to give thanks.
If you're just joining us, you've been listening to Shaquita Thompson, who is the grandmother of Stephon Clark, who was killed last week in Sacramento. Family pictures here that we're showing you. There has been outrage in the city of Sacramento nationwide, and also a lot of questions about what exactly happened. I want to bring in criminal defense attorney Brian Claypool, who's also been listening in. So, Brian, we learned there from attorney Benjamin Crump that the family itself is going to do their own independent autopsy. We know that Stephon Clark was shot 20 times. We were just playing some of the video that we have, both the aerial footage. We know that there is also, as we see here, there is body camera footage. There are also questions today about why those body cams were muted, why the sound on those were muted at a certain point, and we don't have that answer yet from the department. As you look at this, what stands out to you? You've dealt with cases like this.
Yeah, Eric, I've handled over 10 shooting death cases involving law enforcement in California. The first thing that hits me is the lack of proper police protocol. And what I mean by that is what the police department should have done is set up a perimeter, Erica. They should have called for backup, set up a perimeter, for example, a half a block or a block in radius. And then what you do next is you try to engage the suspect. You never walk right in front of the suspect, or an officer should not put himself or herself in what's called the zone of danger, where you're walking right toward the suspect and then you're pointing a gun at them and not giving a command. You need to take a position of cover. These officers should have been behind a wall, behind some kind of barrier, and then they should have engaged him and said, look, Sacramento Police Department, put your hands up, surrender, and then try to have a discussion with the suspect. That's the biggest fatal flaw I see in this. And then also, shooting 20 times. I mean, there's what's called, Erica, in law enforcement, a continuum of force. You've got a billy club. You've got pepper spray. You've got a taser. And you're supposed to go, consider each of those forces before you deploy deadly force. Deadly force is the last option.
So deadly force is the last option, and that's one of the things we just heard from his grandmother. Why not use a taser? Why not shoot him in his arm? Why not shoot him in his leg? We could also hear, though, especially from our law enforcement analysts, when you look at this in the moment, it could be a little bit different. If I think this person has a gun, is that enough of a defense here?
Yeah, but that gets back to my prior point, Erica. When a police officer puts himself in a position of danger, you can't then rely on the defense. Oh, I think he reached for something. It looked like a gun, but it was a cell phone. The point I'm making is, if the police department's following proper protocol, then they're not in a position where they're standing, for example, they're vulnerable. They're standing, in an open space where he is. That's not proper procedure. You're supposed to be behind a position of cover, then engage the suspect. Now it will be a defense. The police department's going to say, hey, it's dark. It's a split-second decision. He's reaching for something. I've got to make a decision to save my life and shoot. That's going to be the challenge that the family is going to have in this case.
In terms of this independent autopsy, which has now been announced that the family has decided, and Benjamin Crump making the point about how difficult of a decision this was, which is understandable. Yeah. What could that reveal?
Yeah, great question. I think what Benjamin Crump is doing here is the police department is arguing, hey, Stephon Clark was charging at the police officer. He was making a move toward the police officer. So I think what Ben Crump wants to do is, for example, look at the angle of the bullet entry and how the bullet traveled in the body. I've had cases before where police departments argue, oh yeah, your client was coming toward the officer. If that's the case, Erica, then the bullet trajectory should be straight through the body. Mm-hmm. Now, if there's a downward trajectory, for example, in any of these bullets, then that goes against the police department's argument that Stephon was charging at the police officer. So I think that's what he wants to establish.
I also want to ask you about this, Brian, because we're learning that, and part of this comes from the video, that they didn't immediately provide Stephon Clark with life-saving help. So it was a full, and I'm going to check my notes here, I believe it was a full 6 minutes that they waited until other units arrived at the scene. The fact that evidence is out there, what does that do?
Well, there's no question about Ben Crump's going to file a civil rights lawsuit for this family. And one of the claims he's going to assert, Erica, is a Fourth Amendment. There's a Fourth Amendment right that you have to receive medical care from a police officer after you've been shot. In other words, it's arguably a constitutional violation that these officers have a duty to intervene then after they've shot a suspect and render medical aid. That's a constitutional right that you and I and Stephon Clark have. So 6 minutes is a long time. All they had to do was, put your hands up. And then if they look over and see no response by Stephon Clark, I mean, that's a 15-second exchange. Then they've got to move in carefully, make sure he doesn't have a weapon, and then they've got to immediately render, CPR and try to stop the blood flow.
Brian, stay with us. Also want to bring in HLN legal analyst Joey Jackson, who's with us now in the studio. Joey, as you look at this and what we just heard from not just Benjamin Crump, but from the family, and you hear, I mean, it is impossible to miss the pain and the suffering in the voice of Shaquita Thompson.
It's heartbreaking, and it's heartbreaking for a number of reasons. The first thing I want to address, Erica, is just going back to the nature of the call. Remember that the nature of the call was there was someone breaking into cars. That's important because it informs an officer's state of mind. We're not talking about someone who was, for example, engaged in a rape, engaged in a attempted murder, engaged in a bank robbery. We're talking about someone who's breaking into cars. And so that pretty much gives an indication to the police of who they're encountering. Now, you take it on from there, and then, of course, at the critical moment prior to death, there's the instance of show me your hands. Well, if you're going to give someone a command, ought you not at least allow them to comply with that command? And in the event for those people who say, well, they thought that the phone was a gun, how about if you are fearful of that, tell them to get onto the ground tactically so that you don't have to think about that. And then you get to the next inquiry, which is that, was the force used, right? Was it responsive to whatever threat that was posed? What represented such an immediate danger, such that the officers had to discharge their firearms in the multiple manner in which they did? So this, it smells on multiple levels. It's a horrific concern. I share Brian Claypool's concern in the aftermath in terms of the rendering of aid. Certainly there's a responsibility on law enforcement to do that. And so I'm just troubled all the way around.
All right. Brian Claypool, Joey Jackson, appreciate it. We're going to take a short break here. We'll be right back.